N-O-S-T, Nost, A-G-A-I-N, again, Nostagain.
Hi everyone, welcome. If you're here for Nostagain, you're in the right place. We're just going to give another few more minutes for people to trickle in.
Oh, now I can see Ruth.
Good.
That's pretty cool. It's a funny thing, isn't it?
Magic needed to start for it to work.
Technical.
Dina,
Absolutely.
Oh, nice. People trickling in. We'll talk about the Q&A function afterwards, of course. No problemo. I'll test out the chat. Hello, chat. There you go. What are folks' choice of drinks today? Mine's water.
Just finished coffee, water.
Water. Okay, so we got 2 for water, 1 for coffee.
Bottle.
I love beverages.
Lemon,
so
I heard from
got
Zoe.
Earl Grey tea and
It's my
water.
Scott is chugging.
And Hanos, what's yours? What's your water?
Water, and I just
Water.
finished coffee.
Very
Oh
good.
yeah,
Yeah.
coffee.
It's funny, I have all of these vessels that I could be drinking water from. Instead, it's like a plastic bottle that I keep refilling.
Yeah, you want to drink out of your plastic water bottle and look at all your other vessels of water that, are for
True.
the eyes.
Can we give it maybe 1 more minute, perhaps? Yeah. Go. And Derek, you've got the final slide, as per usual. Coolio, we came prepared. Neato. Oh, another person came. That's awesome. Very good. Yeah. Are these your students, Chris? Maybe they're like, Prof, you gonna grade our papers?
I don't recognize anyone yet.
You. That's cool. We're glad.
But I did give a virtual tour yesterday for my class, so yeah.
What?
Whoa. Oh, that's fun. Did you pre-recorded it, or you were at home and they were in class?
No, it was just photos.
I see.
Okay, I think we can begin. So, all right, everybody ready? Got your water? So, hi, my name is Richie, Search Unicorn. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, my goodness, of our web series memorabilia.mp4. Memorabilia.mp4 is part of this larger group that we founded here at Concordia called the Nostagain Network. And proudly, we are North America's largest student collective that explores, studies, and showcases work that engage with nostalgia, but in a generative way. And we'll talk more about that later. You can find us on Instagram as at Nostagain, or on LinkedIn and Blue Sky as the Nostagain Network. Needless to say, everybody knows nostalgia, so there's always an in, basically.
So before we introduce ourselves officially, I'd like to give a territorial acknowledgement. At the Nostagain Network, we recognize the traditional territories upon which each participant works or lives, either as invited or uninvited guests. The Nostagain Network is committed to honoring and enacting respect and ethics in the work we do on all traditional and ancestral lands.
Thanks, Derek. For the past 2 seasons, Memorabilia has featured artists, game developers, designers, professors, art educators, musicians, who all explore sort of new ways of thinking and experiencing nostalgia. So not just the past, but the whole conception of it, the whole idea of what it means to miss something, right? Or missing something that has never been around in the first place. And that's something that Chris may be hinting to today in terms of retro futures that he did or did not live through. And so what we mean by generative nostalgia is that instead of looking at nostalgia as a past-based emotion, nostalgia for us is a tool, or rather sort of a call to action for people to come together in the present, to build a community, to find critiques, find newness within old things, and ultimately to use nostalgia for the future.
That is why we are so lucky today to be joined by Christopher Moore, Professor of Design and Computation Arts at Concordia University. In late November of this year, Nostagain had the privilege of exploring Chris's personal design collection. During this visit, 4 members of Nostagain were offered a tour of Chris's things, where they discussed the significance that things play in our lives. Today, we will continue this conversation with Chris, who will elaborate on the culture and design history of 4 objects, actually 5, from his personal collection. We are your moderators. My name is Derek Pasborg. I use pronouns they/them, and I have a Master of Arts in Sociology. Richie?
Yeah, it's me, Richie Srechnikorn, he, him, and a PhD in social and cultural analysis as a student.
Hi, I'm Zoe, and I'm pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in design, and Chris is my old prof.
Hi, I'm Panos. I'm also pursuing a Bachelor of Fine Arts in Design, and Chris was also my prof.
Hi, I'm Ruth, and I'm an independent artist and researcher and Concordia alum. And
Yeah, so all of us from Concordia in Montreal, and we're ready to jump into this. So before we begin, I'd like to mention that if you have any questions at all during the day, during this talk, please put them. I actually don't know if we have the Q&A tab enabled, Richie. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we'll get them in the order that they were posted. Without further ado, Richie?
Yep, thanks, Derek. So here it is, Q&A up top. Some of you may not be used to be using Teams, but it's sort of very structured for us, so we all learn together. The Q&A tab is up there. Put your questions there. We'll ask it at the end of the hour. So then, Chris, we'll open the floor to you before we talk about our individual objects you can see behind us. If maybe as a sort of opener, Chris, if you can talk just a little bit about yourself. Derek mentioned earlier you're a professor in computation design arts. Maybe sort of your fascination with collection and how you define the art or the process of collecting in today's world where there's so much access to kitsch or past or nostalgic looking things. Where does that begin and end, and what does that mean to you in today's world, collecting?
Well, for me, the collections that I've amassed have really been just by instinct and, just things that appealed to me because of their novelty or their colorfulness or their form. And, and then based on the collections that I've amassed, I've done research into the history and of each of the artifacts, who designed them, what period they were from, and I like to think about in terms of material culture, how they were responsive to the culture and time from which they emerged. And so the role of collecting for me is about telling stories of things and, the relationships between things. And I think, I'm going to be able to draw some connections between the artifacts that each of you has chosen, because most of them, by and large, are from around the same era, and they reflect a particular kind of cultural moment, that was a moment of optimism, a moment of hope in light of, a lot of negative things that were happening, in politics and, in society. So for me, the collections, every object tells a story, no matter how banal or everyday, that we can learn something from everything that surrounds us. And I tell my students in first year in the theory course that I teach, the first day I say, you're going to hate me by the end of this course because you're not going to be able to go through the world without questioning and challenging, certain decisions that had been taken, whether intentional or unintentional, looking at a building and saying, well, why did they make that particular material choice? And so on. So the role of collection in contemporary life, I think, is about maintaining a kind of historical record in a way, and to try and learn from what happened, what transpired in the past and to bring that forward. And the way I describe a lot of what I do is designing our way out of the present. So we think about, what's on in the public consciousness today, and how do we use our skills and abilities as designers, I'm speaking from that position, in order to transcend and imagine possible futures that can be much more healthy and positive. I don't know if that's a comprehensive enough overview.
Oh, absolutely, Chris. And thanks for sharing that sort of a lot of nuggets right now that we're thinking about. If I can sort of just reel it back to what you were saying, that one of the things that you taught your students, but also that you shared with us when we went to talk to you at your place, and this is a link to the interview in the chat for folks for later, by the way, is that every object is a story to tell. And indeed, your students might sort of detest that because when they leave your class, the world will become a noisy place because everything is telling its story. So, sort of, let me bring this line then to what you were just talking about, which is sort of your philosophy of designing out of the present, right? Um, Collecting as sort of, you've got an eye for it, you've got an inkling, you hear things out of what you see in everyday life, despite the chaos, despite all these rich stories that you could put together, right? We don't have enough room for storage. How do you, as a designer, sort through what you would like to curate with what, and in sort of what time? How do you put a visual order within all of these stories? Like, I see the bookshelf behind you. How do you compile all those stories in harmony with each other? Or for example, if they represent a retrofuturism, right, for a time that could have been innovation as once seen, how do you display and put that together? What does that look like for you, that process of putting together the stories as an aggregate through objects?
Well, as I mentioned to you when you visited, I have 3 storage units in 3 different provinces full of stuff. And so what you see kind of behind me and what we're going to be talking about is kind of a curated selection of things that are most dear to me and that I think also, speak with one another. Most of the things you're going to see are from a very particular era, primarily from the late 60s, early 70s. And what interests me about that era is, in 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, and, there was this real kind of optimism for what the future might hold. And so a lot of the design language from that period really reflected this kind of space race and, images of, the solar system and so on. Sputnik was like a big influence as well. So I think, the whole idea of the space race gave people hope in a time that, was not very hopeful, especially the late 60s, early 70s, with the Vietnam War and so on. And like so many political and social movements, the women's rights movement and, the March on Washington and so on. All of these things, represented a kind of huge shift in culture during that period. Many of it for being very positive, changes and, providing protections, like the Declaration of Human Rights and all of these other things that were instituted to protect often marginalized communities and provide new opportunities. So that's sort of the pretext for it. The way I actually organize things, like there's kind of a rigid, some might say sterile kind of sensibility to the way that I organize things, but I try and create stories between certain objects. So I know it's not easy to see, but in this cube here, there's 2 kind of characters, and for me, I see them as kind of yin and yang kind of characters. One is very friendly looking and approachable, and then the other one has a scowl on its face. And I see this as kind of like an odd couple coming together. So it may not make sense to anyone else, but there's some sort of internal logic. But there's also groupings. So I have multiples of certain objects, and so I try and put them together, to to build the collection. But a lot of it is just I can't explain. Like it's part of my kind of design sensibility and my design training. I like order and I like, things to be aligned, in very particular ways. But I think, like some of the juxtapositions are just sort of like my own kind of internal kind of joke in a way, or my own kind of sense of humor at play. My space, I find great joy in it. It's very colorful, and I find it stimulates my own creativity for my own work and my own thinking. So when I come home, it feels like I'm entering a space that's purely my own, and I feel quite protective over the collections that I've built, because I remembered the stories of where I acquired almost everything. And when you see it in a flea market, for example, it's sort of decontextualized and it's mixed in with all of these other things. And when I bring them into my collection, they become part of the overall story of all the things in my life, which becomes kind of a grand kind of narrative kind of structure. So I give them new stories. And we were talking when you visited about the multiple layers of stories. So first there's the kind of origin story of the object, the company that made it, and what was the climate at that particular time. And then there's the story of who owned it prior and how it was incorporated in their lives. And then the story of why they chose to get rid of this object. And then my story of acquiring it and building it as part of this overall kind of collection. So there are many layers of stories that can be told, and the artifact becomes the nexus point where we listen to the object and we try and understand those stories that emerge.
Thanks for that, Chris. And we'll definitely get into this during the Q&A. I'll pass it over to Derek, but just to keep it in people's minds, what a fantastic through line in sort of your philosophy between balance, right? That sort of sterile process, as somebody might say, the way you do things, yet it's so deeply personal, or the fact that these things are prompted by historical events like the Sputnik, for example, yet you have a sort of biographical identification, sensibility, yet training. There's a sort of yin and yang that we can explore further. Just before we get into sort of the objects that we've chosen, I think Derek has one more question as a sort of opener.
Yeah, no, I think it'll lead pretty well into our conversation because it has to do with how does your background, your design and historical and cultural knowledge affect your nostalgic relations to these objects? Does it deepen that relationship?
I believe so. I don't think it's necessarily my formal training that comes to bear. I think it's just my curiosity. It's like, when we get to telling the story of the chairs behind in your background, it was really just based on curiosity and wonder. And so I'm not sure exactly how to respond, but I, you know, I just, yeah, I think it's curiosity that really drives kind of my collections, and I want to understand the role that they played, historically and culturally, because most of the stuff I have predates me. Like I never lived through the era in which these objects, came into the world. And so I have that kind of sense of looking backwards about, well, how did these things emerge? What were the contextual factors that resulted in this? And this is something that I'm really interested in, is looking at history and what was happening in the world, and then how those kind of ideas then manifest in various different creative disciplines, whether it's literature, film, fashion, architecture, or objects. And so for me, it's sort of, in some ways, romanticizing the past, and trying to see what we can learn from the past and be able to apply it, to the present and future, which I know like sounds really cheesy and like obvious, right? Like we learn from history. But I think it's really true, especially like, looking at kind of the space race and how that kind of changed, kind of uh, gave people something to focus on. Or if we look at like the 1939 New York World's Fair, it was coming at the tail end of the Great Depression, a period of austerity. And for a brief moment in time before World War II really kicked in, people had a sense of optimism. The theme for the World's Fair was World of Tomorrow. And it was really focused on, these wild kind of science fiction fantasies of what the world could be. The technology hadn't kept up, wasn't available quite yet, but that didn't stop our imaginations from thinking about, rather than focusing on, what has transpired in the past, but really innovating and, speculating on what the world might be or could be or should be.
You're worried about not answering the question, but I think you answered it perfectly. And this is just going to jump right straight into kind of like the objects that we were personally curious about. You have a curated personal collection, but it's also, we found a way to kind of make it personal for us too. So, and I'm going to pass it on to Ruth because I know that Ruth was really interested in one of the objects behind you called the Toodle Loop, just in the bottom, for you, bottom right, but for us, bottom left of your screen there.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. We visited Chris's house and looked around, and I was really struck by the Tulu radio, which you can kind of see small, but it's this spiral radio, and Chris has 4, I believe, of those in your home collection. And I think I was struck by how just charming and like whimsical and animated it seems. Like it's very rare, I feel like, to find a radio that has so much energy in just the shape of it. And it's supposed to be a bracelet, I believe. So designed in the 70s, and perfect. This fashion object. I'm picturing like, someone in the 70s, a kid getting this for the first time and being like, hey guys, look what I got. And you can listen to the radio. I also like the idea that it's a radio. So you're listening to music, but you're also listening to the news, or you're like, keeping up to date with, what's happening at the time. And look at that. It's stunning. And I liked what you said, Chris, about, objects and how romantic they can be. And clearly I have this very romanticized image of people having this radio and wearing it, and, the type of energy that would bring into a person's life. I guess my question I have for you is, I don't know. I don't know if I have a question. Maybe you can speak to your experience about, how you discovered this radio and why you brought so many into your collection.
I think for me, I have a real fixation on this kind of post-war capitalism, this period of, economic stimulation that was facilitated through the introduction of a lot of like kitschy novelty items, to really propel this kind of mass consumer culture. And, the Toodle Loop is, part of that kind of period. It was something to distract us and something to, I say us, I didn't live through the period, but distract the population, to give a sense of whimsy and, and something lighthearted. So there's no reason a radio needs to take that form. Instead, you twist it and it becomes a bracelet that you bring along with you. So yes, like you were mentioning, Ruth, it sort of becomes a fashion item more than necessarily like a technological device. But also, it's interesting too, because you're kind of sharing, what interests you with the world. Like, it's being broadcast from your bracelet. And so, it becomes kind of part of how you choose to present yourself and how you want to be perceived by the rest of the world. Yes, if you're listening to the news, people might make certain assumptions. If you're listening to pop music or rock and roll, it helps it kind of starts to define your identity, both for yourself and as an externalized kind of projection. And yeah, so I just like that a lot of the objects in the collection, they all have the same function. There's a variety of different telephones. They all do the same thing, but they take on these very different, semantic forms, and it's really meant to appeal to personal taste. So there was a period, especially in the post-war period, where it wasn't just about functionality. It was really about, what appeals to our own individual sensibilities. So how can we have an experience that feels more human and more connected to us, especially, with advancing technologies, there's always kind of like a kind of fear of the unknown. So sorry, I'm going maybe off on a tangent, but like the first iMac, that was Bondi blue and then came in a variety of different colors. It was softened, computers before that were beige, and, they were office equipment and they were sort of standoffish. And so the iMac really tried to make something that would fit into a domestic environment and that would appeal to people and be less frightening. I mean, like their first kind of sales pitch was like, one click and you're online. It was one of the first like internet-enabled, specifically computers, to emerge. So I think objects tell us a lot about, our desires at a given point in time, and our fears and, our aspirations.
Thanks for that,
Thank
Chris.
you.
And thank you, Ruth, for sharing sort of your affinity for the Toodaloops. I'm going to sort of take this on the other end, and I'll share my screen again, and I can see Chris smiling. Because when we decided, by the way, all of us, what objects we were going to be talking about, I found myself a little surprised at myself also, that I gravitated over and over to this particular piece. If any of you folks in the chat want to guess what it is, I'll give you sort of like a Jeopardy. Dun, 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 dun. That's Jeopardy, right, Derek? You're old enough to have seen it. So the piece that I gravitated to was actually the cabinet. Despite the history and even the videosphere here that Zoe will be talking about, right, the typewriter. The reason why this sort of resonated with me, I think, and it was an IKEA cabinet, by the way, that Chris said, so I feel a little ashamed of myself, is that it's so interesting to see the way that you've formed and structured your sanctuary. And I'll put that further. People can also see behind Chris as well that his collection on the shelf is mostly tinted in blue, shades of blue and shades of red. And I just made that connection here too within the living room, right? Sort of the primary colors without yellow. That's okay. That's Jetson's chairs. I'm just curious, Chris, so how did you come across this IKEA shelf and why did you choose this sort of metallic locker-esque feel? But more importantly, I also want to hear your thoughts on white space, sort of the use of walls and things that sort of blend in and not as doesn't have sort of as a powerful aura as the rest, not just only to highlight the other objects that you've curated, but also as a sort of clarity, right, in the sanctuary where you come home and you detense in. Can you maybe just make that connection for us between this IKEA cabinet and the use of white space to structure your home?
Well, I can't honestly say why I chose the cabinets. I think I just responded again, kind of like instinctively, but I also wanted to have kind of a neutral backdrop, so that the other objects would pop. The cabinet behind me is also IKEA. I'm not invested in those pieces so much. They're mainly kind of substrates or platforms on which to present these things, but I thought it was really interesting that you chose like an IKEA cabinet, among everything else that's on display. But I think an IKEA cabinet tells a whole other story as well, about, the consequences of flat packing and, shipping and, transportation and IKEA's reputation as being a very unsustainable company for decimating, old growth forests. And, at one point, the IKEA catalog, the printed version, was the second most published book after the Bible. So, the impact of IKEA, is huge. And it began, with very practical and very earnest kind of ideas about, flat packing. It reduces, space for shipping and whatever. But then they started to kind of change their perspective, and suddenly it became about IKEA is democratic because you can put together your own furniture. You can fulfill your own destiny, through the act of, having to put your furniture together. So there's whole other stories, that are invoked by something which is much more a product of mass production. But I mean, maybe if I had to think about my decision for choosing it, maybe it was nostalgia based, because it looks like a locker and sort of reminds me of kind of like maybe my teenage years and that sort of thing. I'm sure it was all very subconscious, not like a calculated decision, but I also liked the proportions and kind of the low profile of the cabinet. So that's the designer in me sort of like just responding to the pure form of the object. But really, it was about kind of something that would kind of fade in the background. And the white walls are just the consequence of moving into a place that was painted pure white. But I appreciate that like the walls just kind of fade into the background, allowing the artifacts to become the stars of the show.
Thank you, Chris. I think Zoe has
There
the
was
next.
this moment while we were leaving your apartment where Panos and I walked by a furniture store and we looked in and we were like, this is so devoid of color. And even though that furniture was also, stark white, the items really popped. So you felt like it was a colorful world and completely different from the furniture stores we happened to peer into, because the objects were really able to stand out. And so even though, again, like there's this connection of the furniture in those stores meaning to be purely functional, but because of the way it's curated, it appears completely different in your space.
Yeah, it's interesting because the building I live in is along the canal, like kind of at the foot of Griffintown. And my building is super colorful. People hate it because it doesn't blend into the landscape. But then you just walk into Griffintown and all of the condo developments, they're all beige and gray, so I don't necessarily respond to the exterior of my building, my own personal sensibility, but I do appreciate that kind of idea of, going against this kind of trend, especially in furniture, of this kind of, everything is beige and neutral, and it's meant to, like not stand out in many ways. Not all furniture, but a lot of contemporary trends are about this kind of very ultra minimalist kind of approach. Yeah. Ruth, you have your hand up?
I do. I was just wondering, like, what do you think that speaks to? Like, why is design now, like, okay, in the 70s we have the Toodaloo and now we have the Apple Watch. And I was just curious if maybe this is, I don't know, if you could speak to like, what does the design that we create now, what is that speaking to for who we are as a society and what we're trying to be or something?
I can only speculate, but I would say it's sort of like a resurgence of conservatism. It's sort of like, like not wanting to have a personality, but really to just sort of maintain the status quo. But I think it's also just a lazy kind of approach to organizing your space, right? Like it's like, oh, if I just choose beige, it's safe. Everything will go together. Like instead of taking risks and, like finding things that are of interest in and of themselves, and then using your imagination on how you then bring all those things together in an interesting way. I mean, I guess that's why like top interior designers get paid so much, right? Because they have a way of understanding how patterns and color and different forms kind of come together in interesting ways.
Mhm. It's funny too because we do have a rise of like identity in social media and like your like being and personhood as a brand, but then at the same time we have this like need to be uniform. Like, anywhere across the world you can find this type of design that's very modern, very sort of minimalist, very sterile, very sort of gray and silver and beige. It's like it's across the world you can find buildings and interior design like this, but it almost speaks to this desire to not have a personality at the same time. Do you think?
Oops, are we frozen?
Are we?
No.
Oh.
We just had a moment of pause.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, we can, by the way, keep these questions towards the end as well, because we do have 3 more folks to go through their objects.
Yeah.
But thanks for that, Ruth.
Yeah.
I think it's so up next. Yeah, we just had a moment of pause there.
Sorry, I thought I'd lost the flow there, but
Now
So,
you're
Zoe,
muted, Zoe.
Sorry, technical issue now on my end. I think that's like a good segue into my object, which is, you can see it behind here, is the JVC video sphere. And I initially was not drawn to this. I had other things that I wanted to talk about, but after kind of hearing other people and their perspectives and the objects that they chose, I was like, I think that it would be a disservice to not pick this, because I remember in the lecture that you featured this in, it like greatly impacted my design thinking, and I think that the space age question is something that is worth exploring. And I kind of want you to talk about that on a bigger kind of scale. So talk about the space age optimism and how it translated into the sphere manifesting.
yeah, so Zoe clearly recognized that I have a thing for spherical objects, and a lot of those objects came from the same period. So the Videosphere was released in 1970, and as I mentioned before, the moon landing the year prior had a great influence over, visual design. And so naturally, this television looks somewhat like an astronaut's helmet. There's no reason the TV had to be in a spherical form. It was really just to reflect kind of what people were interested in at that moment in time. I also failed to mention last time, but it has a chain attached to it so that it can be hung from the ceiling as well. So almost kind of like a floating planet, I suppose. So again, you can kind of see a hint at it there. Potentially it could be floating, in your space. Again, furthering that kind of space age kind of fascination that people had. And I feel like it's both positive and negative, that there was this kind of perception that, okay, we've conquered our world, our Earth. And now we've been able to go into space. And so now we can theoretically colonize space or have space travel. And so then we ignored the issues that we have on our own planet. And so there was optimism that it's like, okay, well, if we've destroyed our planet, that there's always possibilities of just leaving a trash heap behind and going somewhere else. And also in the early 70s, it was the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA in the US. And so there was a new kind of environmental consciousness that after this kind of period of optimism, there was a growing kind of interest in really reflecting upon the 20th century and some of the consequences of industrialization and this kind of mass consumer culture. So, I mean, I see the optimism and the hope with the ideas around the space race, but also it was kind of going to inevitably lead to this kind of reflective kind of period, especially post-Vietnam War. And also, we can't forget about the petroleum embargo in the early 1970s, which meant that the future of plastic was being called into question because oil reserves were super expensive. People couldn't fuel their cars. And so people were sort of reflecting upon, well, maybe plastic wasn't the miracle, material that, it was once considered to be. So in the 70s, we start to see more focus on things that are more crafty, like macrame and crocheting and things like that, as a kind of counterbalance to that kind of plastic optimism of the decades prior. I don't know if I hit on the space race as much as you had hoped, but
No, that's fantastic. Because then my next point is I looked at the lecture notes for this, the where this guy was mentioned in your 261 class, and you also because there was like a great shift because of the oil embargo, there was this kind of shift towards more natural aesthetics. And you bring up the Futuro. So for people that don't know, it's like this weird flying saucer type um, house that's quite difficult to live in practically. And so it was sought out as more of like a designer niche thing. And specifically in that lecture, you say that, these aesthetics were popular, but they were more of a design inclination. And instead, people focused on, like revivalist colonial aesthetics and neo-Victorian aesthetics, and then again like the standard thing we all associate with the 70s, which is wood, like really prominent features of wood in decor and furniture. And so I'm wondering like how you think that came about and how the two aesthetics kind of lived together.
well, the housing project was a Finnish development called the Futuro, if you want to look it up. It's basically kind of this circular modular housing unit that's perched on these kind of bird-like legs. And the idea was that this modular home could be airlifted and put down on these different bases in different locations. And it was made of plastic and came in parts that could be assembled in a day on site. And it was part of this whole space age kind of like dream future, but it was really not responsive to the needs of modern families, or in that it was a communal living space, basically a big sphere, there are many other reasons, but also like the oil embargo kind of killed that project. But there were many other factors like that it wasn't responsive to like real world needs of, feeling safe and sheltered. And so I think, because of, the kind of slowdown of like plastic production and availability, people kind of like returned back to kind of more natural materials, but also the EPA thing, I think also started to creep into people's consciousness. And so I think that affected the aesthetics. So if you look at a lot of designs from the 1970s, there are like these big wooden cabinet TVs and stuff that were meant to look like pieces of furniture and to kind of disguise the technology. And I think there was also maybe a fear, I'm speculating a lot here, but there was maybe like a growing fear about technological advancement. Computers were starting to kind of become more integrated into certain kind of business practices like banking and so on. So I think people were craving for a return to something that was more familiar and, like wood and other kind of natural products, sort of withstand the test of time in many people's minds versus plastic. It was seen as just being completely disposable, and something that wasn't intended to live on. Like I shouldn't have all this plastic stuff, right? Like it was never intended for longevity. It was meant to be of the moment, and not sort of future thinking, like in terms of its durability and durability.
I feel, yeah, like plastic now, whether we like it or not, is kind of the material of the moment. And so, different things have been done with plastic, and it's now viewed as a less valuable object than it would have been, when these sort of things were coming out with the TV, with some of the other objects in your collection. And I feel like that's a good segue into Panos' section because his Alessi's are also plastic.
Yeah, that's a great segue. Because most of Alessi's products are thermoplastic resin, and I recognized like the Nono di Antonio garlic neon green garlic press, and I have a personal connection to the fly swatter because my mom used to dress her whole kitchen in Alessi from top to bottom, and sort of like highlighting Philip Stark as a pioneer with like the juicy salif and designs like the fly swatter. I was drawn to this one specifically. I mean, there were many objects that I could have chosen, but this one is very simple and it has a unique spin on like a regular fly swatter by making it stand on its own, sort of on a tripod and having a face ingrained in its main body. Yeah, I was just like wondering, what is your take on Alessi's mid-century modern futurism aesthetics, and how do those stand out in current object like trends and fads, and yeah.
So just to be clear, the fly swatter behind Panos, it's hard to see in the image, but it's punctured to create this kind of pixelated image of a kind of mean face. So I guess the concept is that, like this mean face is coming to swat the flies. And so they would be terrified of this kind of face coming at them. In terms of Alessi, a lot of they have some more kind of like upscale kind of designer stuff, but they're perhaps best known for their whimsical reinterpretation of everyday kind of objects. So if you need a fly swatter, why not make it humorous and playful and fun and rethink it as, something kind of aesthetically cute, and not just something utilitarian. Or the garlic press, it kind of looks like a gas mask. And so, the whole idea of garlic and, its pungency, makes this kind of object sort of cute. Or if you're going to be scrubbing your dishes, why not have, something that's going to take away some of the drudgery of, having to wash your dishes? So why can't you have a scrub brush that looks like a flower in a pot? Or why not a pasta fork? Why not give it a face? Instead of just having holes for draining, the pasta. So I think Alessi, I can't remember the slogan that they used to use, but it's something like about like humor in the everyday or something like that. And so I really like that it's beyond just pure functionalism, but it inserts a kind of personality and anthropomorphic kind of quality. So we then relate to these objects in a different way than if they were just like a standard fly swatter. Suddenly they become more important to us and they influence our day-to-day life. Yeah, I guess that's sort of my opinion there, but
Again, perfect segue into these chairs, which are, as you explain in our talk originally, the live talk we had at your place, these are very personal for you. And so I have a kind of personal question for you regarding that. Why does it still seem modern to me? Well, does that say more about me and my personal taste, or is it the design and aesthetic itself?
should I tell the origin story first and then get to your question?
Absolutely, do it. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the reason why these are so important to me is that they really started the collection. So when I was 14, my sister was moving into her first apartment and she needed furniture. And so we went to the main downtown Goodwill in Toronto and she was looking for furniture and I spotted this dining table and 6 chairs. And I don't know, I just found them so strange. And they reminded me of the Jetsons and that kind of retro futurism. Although I wouldn't have called it retro futurism at the time. And so I convinced my parents to let me buy 2 of these chairs for $5 a piece. And we had a 3-hour drive home, 5 of us in the car. And so myself and one of my sisters had to situate them on our laps in order to get them home. My parents thought I was nuts for wanting to spend some of my allowance money on chairs, when I don't have a reason to have these chairs. And I just thought they were weird and neat. And it wasn't until I really got to art school that I was exposed to this, I think in a design history class, and I was like, oh, I have those. And then I learned about, the history and significance of them. So they are 20th century design icons, like in every design history book, you'll find them. And they've now become very collectible and valuable. But I mean, their monetary value doesn't matter to me. It's my own kind of attachment to them that's more important to me. But the reason I could acquire them so cheaply is because mid-century modern design was unpopular at that time and no one wanted it. And I suspect the family that previously owned this furniture, they realized it was sort of like, oh, we got to keep up with the Joneses. This is out of fashion and we need to update. And so I found a new home for them. So the reason why they maybe still seem futuristic is that we don't see these kind of pedestal legs very, very often. We think about the archetype of what a chair is. Okay, it's got a seat, it's got a back, it's got 4 legs, and then there are infinite variations on that. Very few people would respond to something that has this kind of retro futuristic kind of appearance because it doesn't blend in with a lot of the other beige furniture that we were talking about before. It needs a kind of particular kind of environment in which it feels, like it's not like a spaceship that landed in your home. that it somehow integrates and has a dialogue with other things. And so I think they blend in well with my collection because the chairs are supported by other things that reflect some of those same values or ideals. Yeah, and I still think that they look very futuristic from my perspective as well.
No, I think you absolutely answered everything perfectly. So I'm looking at the time and realize we've only got a few minutes left. So Richie, do we happen to have any Q&A?
As of yet, no. But
Okay,
folks,
well, I
if you
encourage
are
first person to
Mhm.
first person to post a question. Go for it.
Oh,
Now, unfortunately, I can't unmute so I'm going to ask you to
Braxton,
put
if you
your
want to type,
question in the chat or in the Q&A
lucky.
tab.
By the way, Braxton is in my class currently and got to see the virtual tour yesterday. So thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you everybody for joining. This is a great turnout for something we kind of expected to be a little bit lackluster. So thank you all for coming.
It's the end of the term. Folks, if you are curious and you want to get in touch with Chris, I'm just putting his Concordia page down here with a link to his work, his bio, and his email.
And email. Yeah.
Folks can do that, or through us as well if you want. And we'll just wait till Braxton types up their question. Lucky hand. No pressure, Braxton. Like, oh gosh. Backspace, making all these errors. Here we go. Chris, do you believe as designers that we are constantly stuck to what is the current trend, or can we make things more colorful and whimsy again?
Well, I think there are two paths that you can take. You can take the known route and just sort of like play into current trends and not sort of challenge, the way things are today, or you can innovate and you can sort of challenge those archetypes of, like the chair with the four legs. I said in class one week, I said, why can't a chair have 87 legs? Why do we fall into these traps? And why does a chair have to look that way? A chair is a machine for sitting. And, there are many things we can sit on. We can sit on a boulder, we can sit on, I don't know, we can just sit on the ground, like we have this kind of assumption about what things should be in the world, and that limits us. And I think we need to use more imagination to reconsider, even like a toothbrush, why is the oral hygiene, why is a brush a brush? How are there other ways that we can maintain oral hygiene that aren't a toothbrush, for example? I don't know, that's a dumb example, but yeah, so I think like it's tempting, especially if you're a student kind of like looking to enter into the professional realm, is to replicate what you see out there. It's the safe kind of route, and it's more likely that you're going to get employment, like in a commercial realm. But I think it's more radical, especially if you are a student, where you can take risks, and there aren't sort of real world consequences. You're not having to be beholden to a client and what they want.
Thanks, Chris. And just before Dark closes us off, so I guess the takeaway is, find balance in what you do, be ahead of the curve, and use something else that isn't a toothbrush for your teeth. But don't tell your dentist that because Chris is gonna get sued. So Derek, do you want to close this off as a final sort of spiel?
I mean, what can I say other than this was a really fantastic discussion? The hour has kind of flown by, and it kind of makes you wonder, like, oh God, does memorabilia need a longer time for these kind of discussions? I don't know. That's not for us to decide today, but I'm going to wrap it up here. we are out of time. So I want to thank you all for coming, and I invite you to reach out to Chris if you want to continue this conversation, or hey, if you want us to invite Chris back and have another conversation, definitely reach out to us. I will be sharing our socials, which will be up on the screen in just a second. Right here, here is a QR code to our socials. It'll lead you to our website. Again, our socials, it'll link you to the link tree. And thank you so much for coming. Have yourselves a wonderful day.